Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to quite a list of new members of our Patreon. Erica, Monica, Sarah, Aaron, In the Land of Winter, Emily, Deborah, M.E., and Bastet. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener-supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes and a new series in which we're reading The Wind in the Willows chapter by chapter, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's continue our travel to the world's tallest peak with more from Mount Everest, The Reconnaissance, 1921, by Lieutenant Colonel C.K. Howard Bury, DSO, and other members of the Mount Everest expedition, with illustrations and maps. First published in 1922 by Longmans Green & Co., 55 Fifth Avenue, New York, and in London by Edward Arnold & Co. Let's pick up right where we left off at the beginning of Chapter 3. Let's begin. Chapter 3. From Kambajong through unknown country to Tingri. Our camp at Kambajong, Zhang meaning fort, was pitched in a walled enclosure at the foot of the fort, built on a great crag that rose 500 feet sheer above us. They called this enclosure a bagicha or garden because it once boasted of 3 willow trees. Only one of these 3 is alive today, the other 2 being merely dead stumps of wood. The Zhongpen here, who was under the direct orders of Shigatse, was very friendly, and after our arrival presented us with 5 live sheep, 100 eggs, and a small carpet, which he had had made in his own factory in the fort. Next afternoon, Moorshead, Wollaston, and myself went up to pay the Zhongpen a visit in his fort. It was a steep climb from our camp, past long mendongs or mani walls covered with inscribed prayers. The Zhongpen was at the entrance waiting to receive us. He then showed us over his stables, where he had several nice Tibetan ponies, which strongly objected to Europeans and lashed out fiercely as we approached them. After looking at them, we went up many flights of most dangerously steep stairs, almost in pitch darkness the whole time, until we came to a small courtyard. Then, after climbing up more steps, we were ushered into a small latticed room, where we were given the usual Tibetan tea and sweetmeats. I presented the Zhongpen with one of our new lever-electric torches, with which he was much pleased, saying it would be of much use to him in going up and down his dark staircases. After tea, he took us up on the roof of the fort, which was quite flat, and from which we had a most magnificent view. We stood on the top of a great precipice and looked straight down at our camp, which lay many 100 feet below, but almost within a stone's throw. From here, too, we could look across the wide plains and valleys of the Yaru and its tributaries to the main chain of the Himalayas, which form the southern boundary to the picture. From this side they do not appear nearly as imposing as they do when seen from the south. Seen as they are from a height of over 15,000 feet, the distance to the skyline is not nearly so great, and as a rule, we found the northern slopes to be much less steep than those on the southern side. The snow line, too, was also several thousand feet higher. Every day great masses of moist cumulus clouds came rolling up and round the peaks to the south of us, indicating heavy falls of rain and snow on the south, but very little of this came over the watershed. Only an occasional slight hailstorm or a few drops of rain. From this point we could see as far west as Mount Everest, still over 100 miles away. After spending some time up there and admiring and discussing the view, we descended once more into the fort, where the Jongpen showed us some of the carpets that his womenfolk were busy making, and promised to have some ready for us by the time that we came back. We also much admired the curious old locks by which the doors and boxes were fastened. Before leaving, he made me a present of one of these locks. June 7th saw us still at Kambajong, as the transport would not be ready till the following day. Rayburn, who for some time had been suffering from the same complaint as Dr. Kellis, was unfortunately getting no better and was getting weaker every day. We were therefore reluctantly compelled to send him back again into Sikkim to Lakan, where he could be taken charge of by the lady missionaries and properly looked after. Wollaston and Gyalzin Kazi were to accompany him down to Lakan, and if possible to rejoin us by the time that we got to Tingri. This breakup of our climbing party was most annoying and seriously weakened our party, obliging us to alter our plans for reconnoitering in a thorough manner the various approaches to Mount Everest. The following day, after a good deal of delay and argument about the loads, we got everything loaded up and started off for Linga, a march of about 16 miles to the west. For the first few miles we rode across a great plain, on which were several small herds of goa, but these were very wary and kept well out of shot. The path then took us alongside a small isolated rocky hill, in which we kept putting up numerous hares, who often got up right under our ponies' feet. We crossed the Yaru River, now only a small stream, at the picturesque village of Mende with its fine willow trees, and then, after passing over a spur formed of slaty rock, we descended into another great plain which extended all the way to Tingri. 5 miles across this plain was the village of Linga, surrounded by marshes and ponds, with barley fields and rich grass growing between the patches of water. There were several other villages in sight, so that the plain was evidently fertile and could support a considerable population. This was the first place where we became bothered by sand flies, which in the morning were very troublesome. But when the wind got up, as it always did in the afternoons, it blew them away, and for once was welcome. The villagers were very hospitable. They produced tea and beer brewed from barley for us as soon as we arrived. The latter is quite a pleasant drink on a hot day, but it did not agree with my inside at all. The people here had never seen a European before, and though at first inclined to be rather shy, they soon became very friendly and curious. Some pieces of silver paper from chocolates quite won the hearts of the children, who flocked around and did not in the least mind being photographed. To the south extended the chain of snows of the main range of the Himalayas, and on the way we had several clear and distinct views of Mount Everest. Moorshead, who had left the day before, was camped at a small monastery a few miles to the north of us in order to follow the crest of the ridge of hills and to survey both sides, but was to join us again at Tinki. The weather now was really delightful, though to the south of us we still saw heavy clouds which brought showers of snow as far as the mountains, but they did not reach us. From here to Tinki was about 13 miles over a perfectly level plain. The midges or sandflies were very troublesome the whole way, and came in hundreds round one's head, got inside one's topi, and were thoroughly objectionable. The plain appeared very fertile, as there seemed to be plenty of water, and great herds of yaks and flocks of sheep were grazing upon it. In the marshes and ponds were many bar-headed geese, Brahminy ducks, mallard and teal. After the rains, it is evident that a great part of this plain is under water. About a couple of miles from Tinki, we crossed some curious sand dunes, about 20 feet high, which are evidently on the move. And soon afterwards the Jongpin of Tinki came riding out to meet us, with a few mounted followers, he himself riding a fine white pony. He was very Chinese in appearance, wearing finely embroidered silks, with a Chinese hat and a long pigtail, and his manners were excellent. He escorted us to the place where our camp was to be, and had 3 or 4 tents already pitched for us. Tea and country beer were at once served, and we rested in the shade of his Chinese tents until our transport arrived. We were encamped in a very picturesque spot beside a large pond that was full of bar-headed geese, Brahminy ducks, and terns. On the opposite side of this pond rose the walls and towers of the fort of Tinki. As soon as we had settled down, the Jongpin came again to pay us a formal visit, presented us with 4 sheep and a couple of 100 eggs, and promised to do everything he could to help us and to forward us on our way. Half a mile above us was a large village and a big monastery belonging to the yellow sect of Buddhists, who also owned a fine grove of willows. The bottom of the valley was all covered with barley fields, now a tender green and coming up well. As the fresh transport had not arrived, we had to spend the following day there. This gave an opportunity for Abdul Jalil, our photographic assistant, to rejoin us. We had sent him back to Fari in order to change some more rupees into Tibetan currency, as we found that Indian notes or rupees were not accepted any further to the west. Abdul Jalil had been very nervous about traveling with so much money, and had borrowed a revolver and a rifle from members of the expedition, besides 2 large Tibetan swords and a dagger which he obtained from the Jongpen. In the morning with Bullock, I went to return the call of the Jongpen. His fort at that time was under repair, so he was living in a small house outside the main building. He was very affable and gave us tea. We were then able to make all the arrangements for transport except the actual fixing of the price. For this he said he would have to consult his headmen. Just as we were about to leave, he insisted on our eating the large meal which he had had prepared for us. He gave us small dishes of excellent macaroni and mince, seasoned up with chilies, and very well cooked, much better than anything our cooks could produce. This we had to eat with chopsticks, a somewhat difficult proceeding, as we were not yet used to them. Later on, however, after much practice, we found no difficulty in consuming the numerous bowls of this excellent dish that the Tibetans always set before one. The Jongpan told us that he had been 29 years in government service, and he was expecting to have a better post than this shortly. His health was poor, and he said he had been suffering much from indigestion, so I gave him some pills and tabloids, for which he was very grateful. On the return journey, he told me that he had greatly benefited by my treatment. The bar-headed geese and the wild duck here were extraordinarily tame, allowing us to approach within 5 yards of them and showing no signs of fear. They would come and waddle round our tents, picking up any scraps of food. The Jongpen had begged us not to shoot or kill any of them, as he said a lama had been sent specially from Lhasa some years ago in order to tame the creatures, and certainly the result was extraordinary. It was most interesting to watch these birds, ordinarily so wild, from so close a distance. In the evening, the Jongpen came over to see us again, and after a good hour's bargaining over the price of the transport, we finally reached a reasonable and amicable agreement. Every evening, to the south of us, there were constant flashes of lightning all along the horizon. In the morning, I woke up to the unusual sound of drops of rain, but this only lasted for 5 minutes and then cleared up, though the sky remained clouded all the morning. There was the usual fighting and confusion about the loads, each person trying to get the lightest loads for his own animal. The result was that there was much talking and fighting, and nothing was actually done until some headman would come and take control and decide the dispute. The method of adjudication was as follows. From each of the families who were regarded as responsible for the supply of a transport animal was taken one of the embroidered garters by which the man's felt boots are kept in their place. These garters were shuffled, as one might shuffle a pack of cards, after which a single garter was placed upon each load. The family to which the garter belonged thereupon became responsible for that load and had to pack it upon the animal's back. Although we had only 90 animals, there were 45 different families supplying them. The march from Tinki to Chushernango was about 14 miles and was up the valley behind Tinki to the Tinki Pass. On the way we passed well-irrigated fields of barley and then climbed up a spur covered with a small yellow cistus. After this, a long, gentle pull brought us to the top of the pass, 17,100 feet. There was a very fine view from here to the east, looking over Tinki and Kambajong and along the northern slopes of the Himalayas. I climbed up a hill about 600 feet above the pass, whence I had a more extensive view still. I could see far away to the east to Chomolari, while in the foreground was the large and picturesque lake called Somo Tretrung, backed by the rugged chain of peaks that separated us from the valley of the Brahmaputra. To the west, we looked down into the valley of the Yaru, which flowed gently through a broad and flat valley. To the southwest was a range of sharp granite peaks, rising up to 22,000 feet, which ran north and south and forced the Yaru to flow round them before it could find its way into Nepal. The descent from the pass was much steeper. We passed many of our old friends, the pink trumpet-shaped flowers, also a curious white and pink flower, rather like a daphne in shape, and smelling very sweetly, which grew in masses along the path. It was evidently poisonous, as no animal would touch it. I picked some flowers of it and put them in my buttonhole, but was warned by the Tibetans not to do so, as they said it was poisonous and would give me a headache. Lower down the valley was full of small dwarf gorse bushes, 1 foot to 18 inches high, which carpeted the ground. Everywhere were flocks of sheep and cattle grazing in the valley. Our camp was pitched on a grassy flat just below the village of Kushernango, with its fine old ruined tower of stone with machicolated galleries all round it. To the south of us was the Nila Pass, which afforded an easy way into Nepal. The climate here was fairly warm, but the wind blew very strongly all that evening. Next day we saw the mountains all covered with fresh snow, down to 16,000 feet, but we only experienced a slight drizzle, as most of the snowflakes evaporated before they reached the ground, though clouds remained overhead all the morning. Moorshead and his surveyors had been kept very busy up till now, surveying and plotting in the intervening country from the tops of the hills, but owing to the clouds, they were unable to do anything. We were all very late in starting, as our transport animals had been changed, and the yaks that were supplied to us were very wild. In the first few minutes after starting, we saw the plain strewn with our kits and stores, and yaks careering off in every direction with their tails in the air. The march to Gyangkar Nangpa today was only a short one, and led across a wide plain, through which flowed the muddy and sluggish waters of the Yaru. The existing maps of this country were quite misleading, and we could no longer depend on them. The rivers flowed in opposite directions to those shown on the map, and mountains were shown where there were none. After about 2 or 3 miles, we had to ford the river, which was about 80 yards wide and not quite 3 feet deep. We then rode on across the plain, which was in some parts sandy and in others muddy or gravelly, evidently during the rainy season a shallow lake. In places, the dwarf gorse grew on it. The sandy tracks were covered with curious hillocks 5 to 6 feet in height, formed by the drifting sand and the gorse bushes. These, in order to keep alive, were compelled to push their branches through the sand, which in its turn became piled up around them. Towards the west end of the plain were marshes and shallow lakes, around which we had to make big detours. Gyangkar Nangpa, which was our destination, was the country residence of the Fari Jongpen. His brother, who was acting as agent for him, rode out to meet us and escorted us to his house, a fine solid stone building dominating all the small houses. The tops of the walls were covered with gorse and juniper, rather suggestive of Christmas decorations. Tents were pitched for us in a grass paddock close to a grove of willows. We were then conducted upstairs into a pleasant room, where were some fine gilt Chinese cabinets and some good Chinese rugs. Here the Jongpen had a meal prepared for us. We were first given tea, milk, and beer, after which some 15 dumplings apiece, each as big as a small apple, were put down in front of us together with 3 other bowls. In one of these was a black Chinese sauce, in another a chili paste, and a third contained a barley soup. We were then given chopsticks, with which we were expected to convey the dumplings into the barley soup, break them up there, season them with the various sauces, and then convey them to our mouths, a not too easy feat. This meal was so satisfying that we felt that we did not want to eat anything for a long time afterwards. We were told that in the rainy season, The river here was unfordable, as it rose several feet and flooded over the plains, and it was then necessary to keep to the north or south of it. In the evening, the agent came to make an official call and presented us with a sheep and a number of eggs. We invited him to dinner and gave him his first taste of such European cooking as could be provided by our native cooks. There was a slight frost during the night, but the day turned out very fine. Our host accompanied us to the village of Rongkong, one of the villages belonging to his brother, and here he said goodbye to us. The day's march was uninteresting. We followed along the left bank of the Yaru past well-irrigated barley fields, for there was any amount of water here, until the valley narrowed and the sides came down steeper, when it became covered with gorse bushes. This valley we descended for about 10 miles until it debouched into another, a broader, sandy valley, where the Yaru changed its course to the south. We forded it at a point where it was about 90 yards wide and 3½ feet deep, and we then sat down and waited for our transport to come up. Beyond us lay a wide, sandy valley, through which a stream flowed sometimes on the surface, but more often underground, when it formed dangerous quicksands. When the transport came up, our drivers were very anxious to cross immediately, as there was a strong wind blowing and a violent sandstorm. They said that it would be much safer to cross now, that all the fresh sand had blown over the wet sand. In the morning, they said, after a still night, it was very dangerous. So following their advice, we started off, everyone dressed up as though for a gas attack, with goggles over the eyes and comforters or handkerchiefs tied over the mouth and nose to keep the sand out. At first we wound our way through big sand dunes, off which the sand was blowing like smoke. Under one of these sand dunes we found our coolies halted and lost. Some of the donkeys, too, had been unloaded here, as they could not find their way across in the sandstorm. After leaving the dunes, there were wide stretches of wet sand to cross, over which the dried sand from the dunes was being blown like long wisps of smoke, so that the whole ground appeared to be moving. In places where the wet sand shook and quivered, we galloped along. Eventually we and our transport arrived on the far side of the plain in safety. It was now too late, however, to go on any further, so we camped on the dunes near the quicksands in the teeth of a gale. The sand was being whirled up onto us and into our tents until everything and everyone was full of sand. Water was handy, but yak dung, our only fuel, was scarce and scanty. Just before dark, a very beautiful and lofty peak appeared to the southwards. Our drivers called it Chomouri, the goddess of the turquoise peak, and we had many discussions as to what mountain this was. In the morning, after taking its bearings carefully, we decided that this could be no other than Mount Everest. We found out afterwards that the name Chomouri was purely a local name for the mountain. Throughout Tibet, it was known as Chomolungma, goddess mother of the country, and this is its proper Tibetan name. Next morning, after an uncomfortable and windy night, we rode for several miles across a plain covered with sand dunes, 20 feet or more in height. On reaching the entrance to the valley of Bongchu, I determined to separate myself from the main party in order to explore a peak which attracted my attention on the north side of the valley and seemed to promise good views of Mount Everest and its surroundings. After a climb of some 3,000 feet, I found myself on a spur from which I had a very wonderful view. The view extended to the east from beyond Chomolari, over 120 miles away, and embraced practically all the high snow peaks from Chomolari to Gosantan, a distance of some 250 miles. In the center, Mount Everest stood up all by itself, a wonderful peak towering above its neighbors and entirely without a rival. I spent 4 or 5 hours at the top of this hill, basking in the sun, as it was delightfully hot. I saw several swallow-tailed butterflies, also a number of bees, wasps, and horseflies. Major Morshead and his surveyors soon afterwards joined us, intending to take advantage of the fine view. In the afternoon I left the peak and descended into the valley in search of our new camp, for we had now left the Yaru and had turned up into the valley of the Bongchu, a river that flowed from the west with a very considerable volume of water. As there was rinderpest in the valley, our transport consisted now of donkeys only, many of them being very diminutive in size, but quite accustomed to carrying heavy loads. Our camp was pitched at a place called Trongso Chumbab, where there was an old Chinese rest house. The Bongchu here was nearly 200 yards in width, but there was quite a good ford across it to Songo. Here we found many flourishing villages and much cultivation. We seemed to be entering a much more populated part of the country. From the top of the hill, I counted in one valley no less than 15 villages, and quite a number of willow groves. From here, a longish march of 18 miles up the valley of the Bongchu brought us to Ki Shong, a pretty little village on the banks of the river. There were a few willow trees here, and a lot of sea buckthorn. I did not keep to the road, but started early across a big plain. The day was very hot and sultry, and after crossing the plain, I went up a side valley, which turned out to be extremely pretty. It was very narrow, and a mass of wild rose bushes. These roses were all of a creamy yellow, and every bush was covered with hundreds of sweet-smelling flowers. There was also a curious black clematis, and several species of broom and rock cistus. Here and there were grassy patches with bubbling springs of crystal clearness. Rock pigeons, Brahminy ducks, blackbirds, and numerous other varieties of small birds came down to drink here and did not mind us at all. About 2 o'clock, the weather suddenly changed, and violent thunderstorms started all round us, first on the opposite side of the valley, and then on every side. Heavy hail came down at the same time, and the ground soon became white. On descending into the valley, I put up what was to me a new kind of partridge, also numerous mountain hares. On emerging into the main valley, I noticed a group of 5 large chortens. I was told that the center chorten had been built over a very bad demon and that it kept him down. The other 4 chortens at the corners prevented his ever getting away. The next day's march to Shekarzong was a short one of only 12 miles. We followed the main valley for about 6 miles through some interesting conglomerate gorges, alternating with open spaces covered with sea buckthorn. We then turned off northwards up a side valley, which led us to the town and fort of Shekar. This place was very finely situated on a big rocky and sharp-pointed mountain, like an enlarged St. Michael's Mount. The actual town stands at the foot of the hill, but a large monastery holding over 400 monks and consisting of innumerable buildings is literally perched halfway up the cliff. The buildings are connected by walls and towers with the fort, which rises above them all. The fort again is connected by turreted walls with a curious Gothic-like structure on the summit of the hill, where incense is offered up daily. On our arrival, the whole town turned out and surrounded us with much curiosity, for we were the first Europeans that they had ever seen. A small tent had been pitched for us, but there was such a crowd round it that I retreated to a willow grove close by, which was protected by a wall. As the Zhongpan had not come to see us, Chetan Wangdi went over to find him. Presently he came along with a basket of eggs, and with many apologies for not coming before, but he said that he had had no warning of our arrival. This was but partly true, for though our passport did not particularly mention this place, it authorized all officials to help us to their utmost, and the Zhongpan certainly knew and had heard that we were coming. I asked him to give orders that no intoxicating spirit should be served out to our followers, remembering the trouble we had had in one or two places owing to their all getting drunk. Our tents were all pitched inside an enclosure and in the shade of the willow grove, and above us towered the picturesque buildings of the fort and the monastery. This was by far the largest and most interesting place that we had yet come across. For our mess tent, we were given a fine Chinese tent, such as they always seem to keep for the entertainment of guests of honor. As in most places, there were two Zhongpens residing here, one lay and the other ecclesiastical, and finding that Tingri was under their jurisdiction, we asked them to issue orders to their representatives at Tingri to help us in every way with supplies and transport. June 17th, we spent resting at Shikar. In the morning, Moorshead and I went to call on the Zhongpen. He lives in a poor house at the foot of the hill, his official residence being 3/4 of the way up, but he wisely prefers to live at the bottom, not being very fond of exercise. He was busy adding on to his house, and we were shown into the old part in which he was living. He gave us the usual Tibetan tea and sweetmeats, and then insisted on our having macaroni and meat seasoned with chilies, which was excellent, followed by junket served in china bowls. He had some very fine teacups of agate and hornblende schist, with finely chased silver covers, which I admired very much. That afternoon, several of us went up to visit the big monastery of Shikar Chote. This consisted of a great number of buildings, terraced one above the other, on a very steep, rocky slope. A path along the face of the rock brought us to several archways under which we passed. We then had to go up and down some picturesque but very steep and narrow streets until we came to a large courtyard. On one side of this was the main temple. In this temple were several gilt statues of Buddha, decorated all over with turquoises and other precious stones, and behind them a huge figure of Buddha quite 50 feet high. Every year, they told us, they had to regild his face. Around were 8 curious figures about 10 feet high, and dressed in quaint flounces, which they said were the guardians of the shrine. We then went up steep and slippery ladders in almost pitch darkness, and came out on a platform opposite the face of the great Buddha. Here were some beautifully chased silver teapots and other interesting pieces of silver, richly decorated in relief. Inside the shrine, which was very dark, the smell of rancid butter was almost overpowering, as all the lamps burnt butter. The official head of the monastery showed us round. He was apparently appointed from Lhasa and was responsible for all the revenues and financial dealings of the monastery. We were given very buttery tea in the roof courtyard, which was a pleasant spot, and here I photographed a group of several monks. They had never seen a camera or photographs before, but they had heard that such a thing was possible and were very much interested in it. Before leaving, we went in to see the head lama, who had lived over 66 years in this monastery. He was looked upon as being extremely holy, and as the reincarnation of a former abbot, and they therefore practically worshipped him. There was only one tooth left in his mouth, but for all that, he had a very pleasant smile. All around his room were silver-gilt chortens inlaid with turquoises and precious stones, and incense was being burnt everywhere. After much persuasion, the other monks induced him to come outside and have his photograph taken, telling him that he was an old man and that his time on earth was now short, and they would like to have a picture of him to remember him by. He was accordingly brought out, dressed up in robes of beautiful golden brocades, with priceless silk Chinese hangings arranged behind him, while he sat on a raised dais with his dorje and his bell in front of him, placed upon a finely carved Chinese table. The fame of this photograph spread throughout the country, and in places hundreds of miles away, I was asked for photographs of the old abbot of Shakar Chote, nor could I give a more welcome present at any house than a photograph of the old abbot. Being looked upon as a saint, he was worshipped, and they would put these little photographs in shrines and burn incense in front of them. About midnight that night, I was suddenly awakened by yells and loud shouting and hammering close to my tent, and next to that in which Bullock and Mallory were sleeping. The latter turned out and found that a Tibetan had seized an ice axe and a mallet, and was busy hammering on our store boxes. He gave chase, but failed to catch the intruder. Some of our porters, however, found out where he had gone to, and Chetan Wangdi had him handed over to the Zhong pen. On investigation in the morning, the man proved to be a madman whom his parents always kept locked up during nights when the moon was full, but he had managed to escape, so we handed him back to his family. Our transport was very slow in arriving, and there were so many delays that it was midday before the procession finally moved off. The loads, too, were very badly put on and kept falling off. Also, the transport was quite the worst that we had yet had. For about 5 miles, the path went up and down hill and through much sand until we came to the bridge over the Bong Chu. This bridge consisted of 4 or 5 stout pillars of loose stones, which acted as piers, on which were laid a few pieces of wood, on which flat stones were placed. It was a rough form of bridge, but served at ordinary times for its purpose. During the course of this summer, however, after heavy rain, these piers so dammed up the water as to cause it to rise some 4 or 5 feet on the upper side of them, with the result that the immense weight of water swept the whole bridge away. Bullock and Mallory, with half a dozen porters, had left early in the morning, intending to bivouac out for a couple of nights, and climb one of the hills to the south of the Bong Chu in order to get a view of Mount Everest. After we had gone about 5 miles, we met them close to the bridge, as they had lost their way, and had been walking for about 15 miles. Not having found the bridge, they had forded the river and had got wet up to their necks in crossing it. At dusk, we reached the village of Sakor, where we found a tent pitched for us, and here we spent the night. Our transport did not turn up till nearly 9 o'clock, so we all slept in the mess tent. From here to Tingri was still another 20 miles, the path following the right bank of the Bongchu the whole way. In places the river was as much as 200 yards wide and flowed very sluggishly. We were told that the waters were very low, but that next month when the rains had broken, the river often filled the whole of the bottom of the valley. On the way, we passed some very handsome black-necked cranes, as large as the saurus crane. These had black heads and bills, with red eyes, light gray bodies, and black tails with fine feathers. On this march the midges were dreadfully annoying the whole way, and we were surrounded by clouds of them the whole time. Their bite was very tiresome and extremely irritating. On the way, we passed a Mongolian who had taken 11 months in coming from Lhasa and who was on his way to Nepal. His method of progression was by throwing himself at full length down on the ground. He then got up and at the spot where his hands touched the ground, repeated the motion again. As we approached Tingri, the valley widened out and bent round to the south. Tingri itself was situated on the side of a small hill in the middle of a great plain, from which, looking to the south, was visible the wonderful chain of snowy peaks, many of them over 25,000 feet in height, which extends westwards from Mount Everest. We crossed the Ra-Chu, a tributary of the Bongchu, partly by bridges and partly by fords. It was split up into a number of small and very muddy channels that took their rise from the Kietrok Glacier. Tingri was to be our first base for reconnoitering the northern and northwestern approaches to Mount Everest. It was June 19th when we arrived there, so that it had taken us just a month's traveling from Darjeeling to perform this part of our journey. And with our arrival at our first base and the end of Chapter 3, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Mount Everest, the Reconnaissance, 1921, which continues to be a fascinating picture of that region at a time when the West knew so little about it. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the many photographs in it, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.